Okay, welcome back to the Orbis Century Report. Here we are in part 3. We're going to continue where we left off. Hope you enjoy.
Do I have contrary equivalents today that I need to be aware of? And this really enhances critical thinking skills. This will hone your critical thinking like no other thing that I can think of. It's a very valuable methodology for anybody. I don't care if you're a housewife, if you're a pastor, if you are a military officer or political leader. This kind of thinking and reasoning is immensely useful. It does take time, and you have to get away from the phone, and you got to get away from blasting TVs, and you've got to have some contemplative space, physically as well as emotionally and mentally. So I'm not saying that's going to always be easy to do, especially in our busy lives we all lead, but you've got to find that space if you really want to draw value out of history. There you go.
Yeah, I love it.
That's really, really good. And I think about what drives us to avoid the contrarian study, to counter our own presuppositions, our own assumptions. And one thing I've thought about, I think about this kind of being a feature of the current society that we live in today, not just ours, but all over the world, because I've lived in multiple places in the world, is the tendency for someone to think, I've got to find comfort in something. I've got to protect whatever it is I'm choosing to believe that's right. I got to protect that. And so I got to find a narrative or find an idea, find something that backs that up, and avoid challenging that assumption, because that assumption gives me comfort. That assumption is the thing that I'm resting on for my personal, emotional stability. If that thing that I believe turns out to not be true, it threatens my family, it threatens me, it threatens my economics, my existence. This is a very common thing, I guess, even in markets, that market practitioners they built computer systems to perpetuate the narrative that they are holding comfort in, even when the fundamentals are not there. And it makes me I kind of wanted to, when I think about that, what would you say would be some of the, going back to, I want to kind of, peg your brain on the Civil War kind of thing. What would you say are some of these fundamental assumptions that maybe both Southerners and Northerners felt that were contrary to each other, that were kind of underlying driving belief systems that people adhered to at the time, that helped expand and increase the polarization of the time?
So, a great question, and to fully answer it, George, we'd be here all day. But I will endeavor to be as brief as possible, but also succinct and give listeners some good answers to that great question. So, the bottom line issue is one of fear for both sides. Fear about what, from the Northern perspective, the expansion of slavery was going to do for the future political power of common Northerners, and for the accessibility to free markets and to the land of the West, and also to how votes were going to go in Congress. Fear that if you open up more land to slavery in the West, you're going to increase the votes in the National Congress, the Senate, and the House, by slaveholders, and they're going to ultimately vote against other issues, not just regarding the slavery question, but things like tariffs, things like free land for immigrants, things like what do we do about some of the Caribbean islands, which a lot of the Southerners had their eyes on. Cuba was a target for many years. It's back in the news today. But in the 19th century, we sent filibustering expeditions. We, meaning the United States, primarily the southern states, sent various expeditions into Cuba and the Sugar Islands trying to instigate rebellion against their colonial powers with an eye towards making them American possessions. Why? Because this was going to be fertile ground for cash crops and for slavery that would support it. There was fear in the North of what this would all entail if you don't stop this, quote, slave power from gaining the ascendancy in the National Congress, in state houses, and their affiliates in the northern states, whom they called dough faces. James Buchanan is often seen as the great ideal of a northern dough face, a northern man with southern principles who was a toady for the southern slaveocracy. I mean, these are all terms that were used at the time: slave power conspiracy, slaveocracy. Folks, conspiracies are nothing new. We've had them all since the beginning of the founding. Right. I mean, Jefferson and Adams accused each other of these things before the election of 1800. I mean, I won't go back that far, but at this time, there was a fear in the North of what an expansion of slavery was going to mean vis-a-vis all these subjects. In the South, the fear was also very real and palpable, and there are some great books literally talking about the fear in the first states to secede, such as South Carolina. A guy named Channing wrote a great book in the late 40s or 50s called Crisis of Fear, Secession in South Carolina. It was on my graduate school reading list. It's just superb. It's an oldie but goodie, and explains how truly fear reigned supreme in South Carolina about what the intentions of the new Republican Party that just won in 1860 under dark horse candidate Abraham Lincoln, what it was going to do. And it didn't matter that Lincoln and the Republicans assured the southern states, we are not going to try for a constitutional amendment to outlaw slavery. We couldn't do it anyway. We don't have enough votes in the states. We couldn't do it anyway. But we do want to limit the expansion of slavery. Well, that latter idea provoked such fear in South Carolina, and it spread around to the other states. They had their own versions of it. A belief that the limitation of slavery, as I said before, meant that the way of life of the slaveholding South, which just about everybody was connected to if you were a white Southerner, this meant that there was going to be an unconscionable and unacceptable threat to that way of life that had become so ingrained since the early colonial period. And so fear underlay both the North and the South in the outbreak of what would become the secession crisis and then ultimately the war. Some other things that I would just offer, beyond this, the average white Northerner did not want he didn't want slavery expanded because he was afraid that ultimately if slavery expanded, the Northern liberty laws might get abrogated, and that meant not only possible economic competition, especially if you're an immigrant Irish working class laborer. You don't want that competition possibly from slave labor coming to Philadelphia or New York City. But there's also a bit of concern racially, and again, contextually, people forget about this. The white North was as biased against African Americans as the white South was, and it was a different kind of bias. As an old colloquialism that came up in the early 20th century went, the white North disliked African Americans, it disliked black people as a race. They didn't want them there. And you got to remember, the free black populations of the northern states were quite small. There just weren't that many. And they didn't want them up there at all. They feared expansion of slavery, expansion of the slave power meant there would just be more black people. And they didn't want that. And then in the South, the adage goes, well, they didn't like black people as individuals. They knew they needed the African Americans to serve as slave labor, but they didn't like the individuals among them who were free, and they didn't like those that ran away and challenged the system who were slave. And so it's a very interesting statement. This was made by some early historians in the 20th century, but I think it still rings true as a general indicator of how both sides thought about black people at the time. And both sides were, by our standards today, irretrievably racist. But that's the context of the day, and we got to recognize that for what it was. And so a lot of white Northerners didn't want slave power to expand because it meant they were going to have black neighbors. And that meant those black neighbors might marry their white daughters and so forth. And you get into fears of miscegenation that still persist today. You know, it is a deeper issue and far more complex, to go back to that, than I think is popularly known. Mm-hmm. And the issue, again, too, now to get to another thing, there was definitely a belief economically by the manufacturers in the North that the tariffs that were imposed to protect, well, I should say that the tariffs that were imposed to protect northern manufacturing in the North, which was industrializing at this time, this was perceived in the South as unfair because they bought their goods from both the North and from Europe. And they were paying a lot more money. Here's this tariff issue that's still with us today. For imported refined products from Europe, say England and France, than they thought was necessary. And they said, well, look, why should we pay twice as much for a piano that's made in England or a grandfather's clock that's made in England and be forced to buy a subpar quality item from Boston just to avoid the tariff? Now, this rankled Southerners. This started part of the nullification crisis of the 1830s, which Andrew Jackson wrestled with, and he put down a hard, interestingly, as Southerner and a slave owner himself, he put down a hard foot on that, and as a nationalist said, look, South Carolina, if you want to nullify the tariff and you want to say, sorry, we're not going to adhere to it, I'm going to send troops into the state and I'm going to enforce the national law. This is similar to how Abraham Lincoln looked at the Fort Sumter crisis and looked at the confiscation of federal property in the seceded states, and it became a legal question, George. And many in the North said, look, these secessionists are extra legal. They're taking over federal property our tax dollars paid for. And then when they fire on the flag at Fort Sumter, this was seen as treason. This was seen as treason by your average white Northerner. It was the firing on the flag at Fort Sumter that turned a lot of lukewarm and fence-sitting Northerners into supporters of the suppression of the rebellion and, in a de facto sense, supporting the Lincoln administration, even Democrats. Hence, we see the advent of the war Democrats. They didn't like the domestic policies of Abraham Lincoln. They didn't want emancipation later when it comes. But they thought the firing on the flag was treasonous, and they're going to support the government, regardless of who's in power, to suppress this rebellion because they saw it as unlawful, as unconstitutional. The future Confederates said, look, the Constitution says nothing about the extra legality of secession. In fact, we think it implies it. And therefore, we think it's completely legal to secede. And show us, Yankees, where you'll find in the Constitution saying secession is wrong. And of course, Lincoln made it clear. He said the founders would have never created the document if they wanted the ability built into it to destroy the Union. This was not the implied idea of the founders. But both sides had a constitutional legalistic argument here. And at the context of the time, you have to remember that as to how they justified their actions. So I hope that answers your question, George. That kind of gets into some right flank, left flank, but it's often, again, ignored when people just make quick decisions.
But the extremes of the emotions are prevalent on both sides, whether it's the right or the left.
Yeah. Right. It becomes reactionary, not responsive, but reactionary.
Yep.
Right.
100%. Knee-jerk reaction. And, you know, the departure of the Upper South out of the Union after Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers, which he did as a reaction to the Fort Sumter crisis and the firing on the flag and the surrender of the fort. He said, we got a full-scale rebellion now. I'm calling on all the states to support volunteers because I don't have a regular army big enough to put down the rebellion. He knew that. I mean, our regular army was 12,000 men in 1860, and most of them were deployed on the frontier as constabularies to kind of watch the Indians and to escort the wagon trains going across the plains.
Wow.
And Lincoln said, we need more people. So he calls for troops. The northern states respond in abundance. The upper South, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and North Carolina, they say, oh, heck no, we're not going to contribute to this unconstitutional call to suppress our kin in the other southern states. It's unconstitutional, Uncle Abe, so we're going to resign, and we're going to secede from the Union and join our fellow Southerners. And historians have debated whether Lincoln made the right call. You can take that either way. That debate's still out there. It's kind of interesting. You can make a case either way. But, this was a reaction as well. The Upper South, which had up to that point been primarily loyal, and there had been a lot of Union sentiment in Virginia, for instance. I actually did a lot of work on this in undergrad and graduate school. After the call for troops, it dissipates. And people who were Unionists turned secessionist overnight because they saw the Lincoln call for volunteers to suppress the rebellion as unlawful use of force and unconstitutional. Knee-jerk reaction, unquestionably. And so when we see this today, we shouldn't be surprised. This has happened so many times in our history. I could give you other examples. Incarceration of German and Austrian Americans in World War I. Which nobody remembers. But, there were concentration camps in the United States during World War I where people of German and Austrian descent, hundreds of thousands of them, guys, were put into American concentration camps after we joined the Allies in 1917. It was a knee-jerk reaction by the Wilson administration because they were seen as potential aiders to our enemies, Imperial Germany and Austria at the time. Nobody remembers that. My colleague over at the University of Vienna, Jürg Nagler, wrote a great book. Unfortunately, it's in German, and most people don't have access to it. But it's all about how these, many cases, naturalized Americans. Some of them were in the process of naturalization, were incarcerated in these camps. Knee-jerk reaction. I just offer that as another example to back up my claim. This has happened repeatedly in American politics.
That's very interesting. It kind of shows, and it also it illustrates how quickly national sentiment can turn when there is some kind of major national policy that is reactionary. So it's something that we should all think about, and that's kind of part and parcel to the whole fourth turning idea. And part of the reason why the fourth turning happens is that the people 30, 40 years ago that still remembered the polarization of the last crisis period and had experienced it have all died off for the most part. And so they haven't been around for the last 30 or 40 years to temper the extremes in policies and extremes in ideas that might otherwise mitigate these forces that cause greater division.
Yeah. No, this is good. I can't help but think that as you're explaining the reactionary element, that I'm hearing echoes as a Canadian in terms of what's happening presently in our Canadian culture, as we are seeing opposing dynamics, opposing forces, opposing visions of where my country should go. And in many respects, while it was there before COVID, it was fueled. The flames were absolutely fanned at a high rate of speed when we saw the convoy and the Emergency Act brought forward, which froze bank accounts and created a state of emergency. And now we're seeing a response to that, especially I'm in Western Canada, but you're seeing a response to that, particularly in Alberta. And there's a lot of complexity, a lot. And it's not just simply Western alienation in Canada. We also have Quebecois separation. And so but these are all going back to these complex realities that continue to have an effect and then we're dealing with things like all of a sudden you've got a black swan event, COVID, and the response, pardon me, not the response, the reaction to it wasn't a response, it was a reaction. Some of it was thought out, a lot of it wasn't. Most of it, I would surmise, is not, I'll maybe just leave it right there. But okay, all of a sudden my own country is facing this internal schism, and this coming October, the province of Alberta will be having a vote on whether they stay within Canadian Confederation or look to try to do something different.
Yeah. This goes to the old adage, Carl, that there's nothing new under the sun. It's
Exactly.
all been done before. And what's behind that? I'll offer this to listeners. What's behind that old aphorism? Well, what's behind it is the reality that the human condition is a constant through time, from ancient times to the present, and people are going to be people, and we're not yet cyborgs, thank God. We don't have chips in our head yet. Yeah. And so we are going to have emotional responses to things. We're not the Vulcans from Star Trek who try to contain their emotions. We are people with emotions like the people of the past did. And there are going to be commonalities in how people are going to react to certain crisis situations, regardless of time or place. And I would say regardless of geography also, because people are people, and there's that commonality. We make the case in the War College a similar thing exists about the nature of war. The nature of war, not the character of war, which changes over time and place. We don't fight with bows and arrows anymore, or spears. We fight with precision-guided munitions and stealth aircraft and things like that. But that's character of war. The nature of war has to do with omnipresent factors that never go away, friction, fog, human decision-making and its fallibility and its assumptions that go into it, the significance of the policy strategy nexus and interface. I could go on and on, but the same thing applies to the human condition. And, as I tell my students, let me put on my surprise face. This really is not a surprise that there are these waves of action, reaction, counterreaction. It's unfortunately somewhat Hegelian. I hate to say anything that supports Hegel, but I think that there is something to this, and that you see this going on throughout the entire history of humankind. And it's going on in Canada, it's going on in the U.S., and it's going on in Europe. Where it's not going on as visibly are in the totalitarian regimes like Russia and China, but make no mistake, it's going on there too. It's just not getting reported, and it's not getting out to us as much. But this is not anything new.
Exactly.
It's really good. Well, that is... This is probably a really good spot to wrap up our conversation. We're up at an hour and a half on this point. Carl, did you have any final thoughts you want to ask?
Well, number one, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Keller. I mean, my goodness, for taking the time to come on our podcast and have this conversation. This is enriching. I find the entire conversation absolutely enriching, and it should be a challenge to all of us, our listeners and ourselves, to examine how we're thinking and the importance of why we need to think, why we need to understand not just simply history, but then how we process it in a way that we can learn from it. And we've always heard the adage that, we're doomed to repeat history if we don't understand history or know history. And we're seeing it. Nevertheless, I think, Dr. Kelly, your point on the human condition is, for us as Christians, crucial, as we recognize that's the one element that we cannot take out of this, the human condition across the board, from our fall to our present time and into the future. So this has been an exceptionally, I think, enriching conversation. Thank you both for taking the time to work through this. And I'm hoping we can have another conversation down the road.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Yes,
Well,
thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Carl and George, for the invitation. It was really my pleasure, and I look forward to a return visit at your convenience.
Okay. Well, let us just, as one last thing, I'd like to give you an opportunity to share a little bit more about how people can follow you. Maybe get a hold of your books or your podcast or the things that you put out publicly. If you wouldn't mind telling our listeners how they might be connected to you.
I appreciate that, George. So I do have an author's website. It's www.christianbkeller.com. All one word, Christian B. Keller. If you have a high security computer, you may not break through. It is a safe website, but for some reason it gets identified on the really high security computers sometimes as not safe. It is. On there you'll find all of my books. My most recent one is not on there because it's still being marketed, but it will get on there. You'll also find a nice listing, most of which you can just press on the image and it will show you my better YouTube videos. There's other ones I did not select and I did not put on the website. You can find me on YouTube by just putting in Christian B. Keller. If you don't put in the B, you're going to get a German Olympic swimmer and actually a theologian, interestingly. But put in the B, you'll find my various talks. But I have collated the better ones on my own website. I can take emails off of that, and that function is working. My podcasts are about to be functional on the website again. My tech team's finishing that up. However, if you can't get it to work, do go to Apple Podcasts or any of your podcast servers and providers that you like. You can find them on there. It's called the Civil War Strategy Podcast, and I'm about to add a couple new ones on the Antietam campaign of 1862 and the Overland campaign of 1864. It's all about the big level bird's eye view of the strategic significance of these campaigns and why we should care today. And there's always some nuggets of takeaways for any person that I add into those commentaries. But you can access the first 7 right now if you're interested. So that's what I would say. George, thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you. And a big thank you to all of our listeners. And we pray that you all will be blessed and are encouraged by the things that you're hearing. Even as we go through challenging times, we know that God is sovereign and His love is secure and true. And we hope you will stay with us. So stay tuned, and we'll see you again soon.